Welcome back to this series exploring Herman Dooyeweerd's Roots of Western Culture. In this episode, we're going to look through the first few pages of Chapter 1, which explores the religious antithesis. I'm going to give us a kind of overview and summary of what's going on in this section, and then focus in on a couple of key passages. Dooyeweerd begins by telling us that the word antithesis just means opposition. But then he's going to explain the difference between what he calls theoretical antithesis and religious antithesis. It's the second that he's most interested in this book. The theoretical antithesis is where concepts are set against each other and contrasted. So you've got the idea of distinguishing different elements of reality. But since these elements of reality are experienced together, then within theory it's always possible to unite them in a kind of higher synthesis. He uses the example of motion and rest and saying that both are examples of being. It's referring to Plato in that. He also talks a bit about Hegel and the idea of dialectic in Hegel. The religious antithesis is different because the opposition isn't an opposition between elements of experience, but is an opposition between alternative absolutes. And these therefore cannot be brought together in a higher kind of unity or synthesis. He then goes on to identify his idea of religious ground motives, describing them as the deepest driving forces behind culture and society. And this is going to be the focus of his analysis throughout this book, this idea of religious ground motives. He then gives a brief historical overview, and we can see that it's not a kind of philosophical history. He's not mentioning names and analysing different thought patterns. He focuses rather on the leading power in society and how that shapes society. He then talks about these four religious ground motives, and he's going to argue that three of them are dialectical. So we need to think a bit about what he means by dialectical. And for two of these, this is a result of deifying or making absolute part of created reality. So if we think back to theoretical antithesis, that's an analysis of created reality where these different elements ultimately fit together. They cohere together in one kind of unified reality, and everything within that kind of fits together and is relative. If we make an element of that absolute, then Dooyeweerd is going to explain that's going to create a dialectical tension, which we'll explore a little bit more later. Dooyeweerd says that theory is unable to solve the religious dialectic, and the reason for that is because theory is focused on, if you like, the details, the isolated elements of reality, whereas before that work begins, there's already a choice of what is absolute and how everything fits together. So that happens prior to theory begins its work. Another source of religious dialectic, though, is the attempt to combine Christianity with another religious ground motive, either coming from Greek antiquity or in more modern times with humanism. One common way in which Christianity is combined with either Greek thought or humanism, and in a way that tries to reduce the tension created, is to separate off Christianity and assign it a particular religious sphere where Christianity takes the lead, and then allow either Greek thought or humanism to take the lead in some neutral or natural sphere. And so that's an important idea, this idea of a natural sphere and a kind of supernatural sphere of religion. Dooyeweerd ends this section reflecting again on how we should accomplish this dialogue, and argues that genuine dialogue involves listening to other people's deepest motivations, being willing to take them seriously and to learn from them. The first section I'm going to focus in on is near the bottom of page 8, and Dooyeweerd makes some quite interesting claims. He says that the absolute has a right to exist in religion only, and then a little further down he says theory is always relative. It's important to understand that this is not a form of relativism. Dooyeweerd believes in truth and believes in theoretical truth. It's also not a form of disregarding theory as something unimportant. Dooyeweerd dedicated his life to theoretical activity. Theory is important and it has its contribution to make. His point, though, is that theory focuses in on aspects or elements of our experience, and therefore it has an isolated and abstract view, and what it analyzes can always be related back to the larger reality from which it's been isolated from. So that's the sense in which the elements that theory analyzes and explores is relative. Religion then is Dooyeweerd basically defines as our commitment to what we take as ultimate or absolute. So Dooyeweerd pretty much defines religion in terms of what is absolute. So what do we relate everything ultimately to? What is the ultimate ground of existence or origin of ourselves and our world? And Dooyeweerd, as part of the kind of Kuyperian tradition from Abraham Kuyper, believes that human life is fundamentally religious. This in fact goes back to Augustine as well. So this idea that if we're not worshipping the true origin and creator of the world, then we will turn some element of creation into an idol. And that's an important idea as to how religion plays a role within society, even for those people who would say that they're not religious. They don't believe in God, for example, but they make absolute certain elements of created reality. To understand this idea of making absolute some relative part of creation, it's helpful to skip on to page 13. There's a really interesting little section. It's a little bit abstract, but let me read some of it and then explain it a bit. So Dooyeweerd on page 13 says the religious dialectic arises when a religious ground motive deifies and absolutizes part of created reality. This absolutization calls forth within a necessity the correlates of what has been absolutized. That is, the absolutization of something relative simultaneously absolutizes the opposite or counterpart of what is relative, since one relative part of creation is necessarily related to the other. I'll let you read on a little bit, but it does come across very abstract, so it's perhaps helpful to give an example that Dooyeweerd will develop later. So we're taking some element of created reality and making it all important. So we can think about the idea of human freedom and how human freedom has become something incredibly powerful and incredibly important. And when we absolutize that, we have to recognize that actually human freedom has links with lots of other things. So for example, we might ask, how does human freedom get expressed? And a very common answer has been that it gets expressed through science and technology, through our understanding and control of the world around us. So human freedom is expressed in controlling nature and changing it and shaping it according to our wishes and desires. The problem with this is that as we seek to control nature, we end up controlling ourselves, because human freedom is necessarily related to our own nature and our place within nature. So you get this kind of dialectic that Dooyeweerd will later describe between a freedom motive and a science or natural control motive opposing each other and kind of requiring each other but also cancelling each other out. Dooyeweerd ends this section by returning to his theme of a genuine dialogue. And I think there's a lot of relevance in what he has to say here for us today when we think about divisions in society, when we think about the role of social media and the tendency to back our own side and view our opponents as perhaps stupid or less educated. So Dooyeweerd's not interested in an argument where we prove our own side right and the other side wrong. He says a serious discussion needs to look for and seek out the deepest drives behind the different various viewpoints. He also says, I think this is quite interesting and quite beautiful in a way, he says that when we see that the religious motivations of others seem quite foreign and strange to us, we shouldn't dismiss them, but rather should be prepared to listen and even learn from our opponents. And he re-emphasizes again this idea that this is not an academic discussion, that it involves us personally. It's about how we understand ourselves in the world and how we understand society and what makes a good society.